Welcome, enlightened ones. Let's elevate. I want to talk to you like we're already mid-conversation, like we didn't just meet, like you already know why this topic landed in your chest the second you saw it. Because when someone says, you have to know when you are the problem, your body reacts before your mind does. Something tightens, something resists, something wants to defend, or justify, or explain. And that reaction right there, that's where the truth lives. Because growth doesn't start when you're pointing outward. It starts when you're brave enough to turn the mirror around and not look away. This is not about shaming you. This is not about blaming you. This is not about tearing yourself down or carrying guilt like a punishment. This is about self-respect. This is about emotional maturity. This is about power. Because the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who messes up. It's the one who refuses to see themselves clearly. And the most powerful person in the room is not the one who's always right. It's the one who can say, something in this is mine. You don't become enlightened by being perfect. You become enlightened by being honest. And honesty doesn't mean I'm always wrong. Honesty means I'm willing to check myself. Because let's be real. There are moments where you were misunderstood. Moments where you were mistreated. Moments where you were reacting to pain. And there are also moments where you were defensive. And if you only ever tell one side of the story, you keep yourself stuck. You don't grow by pretending you were always the victim. And you don't heal by pretending you were always the villain either. A lot of people want accountability from everyone else while offering excuses for themselves. They want grace without giving reflection. They want understanding without understanding themselves. And the ego loves that. The ego loves a story where you're always reacting, never initiating. And if everywhere you go, things eventually blow up, fall apart, or turn tense, you owe it to yourself to stop blaming the world. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you're a human with unexamined habits. Because now your worth is no longer tied to being flawless. It's tied to being real. And real people own their mess without letting it define them. They don't weaponize self-awareness to beat themselves up. They use it to break cycles. Because cycles don't break by accident. They break by choice. And choice requires ownership. Sometimes you were the problem because you didn't listen. You listened to respond. You listened to defend. You listened to interrupt. But you didn't listen to understand. Sometimes you were the problem because you assumed intent. You filled in gaps with fear. You decided what someone meant without asking. You reacted to a story you told yourself, not to what was actually said. Sometimes you were the problem because you avoided responsibility and called it peace. You ghosted. You withdrew. You went silent. Not because it was healthy, but because it was easier than being accountable. Sometimes you were the problem because you expected emotional labor you weren't willing to give. You wanted patience but offered pressure. You wanted understanding but offered judgment. You wanted softness but led with sharpness. Sometimes you were the problem because you were operating from unhealed wounds and calling them standards. You weren't protecting yourself. You were protecting your pain. And pain protected long enough turns into personality. That's why self-reflection matters. Not so you can tear yourself apart. So you can put yourself back together with intention. Because the goal is not to never be the problem again. The goal is to catch yourself sooner. And let me say this clearly. Apologizing does not mean you're weak. It means you value connection more than control. And a real apology doesn't explain. It doesn't justify. It doesn't say, I'm sorry, but. It says, I see it, I own it, I'll do better. And then you actually do better. Not once. Consistently. Because words without changed behavior are manipulation. And here's the part people don't talk about enough. You can be the problem in one chapter and still be the solution in the next. Nothing about self-accountability says you are stuck there forever. It says you are conscious enough to evolve. And evolution requires endings. Endings of old reactions. Endings of old defenses. Endings of old narratives. Sometimes the problem wasn't that you were malicious, it's that you were immature in that area, and maturity is learned, not bestowed. Nobody comes into this world knowing how to regulate emotions, knowing how to communicate needs, knowing how to handle conflict with grace. We learn by messing it up, but the lesson only counts if you actually learn, not if you rationalize, not if you rewrite history, not if you surround yourself with people who never challenge you. Growth requires someone or something to tell you the truth, and sometimes that someone is you, late at night, after the dust settles, after the adrenaline fades. When you replay the moment and realize, I could have handled that better. That realization is sacred. Don't run from it. Don't numb it. Don't drown it out with distractions. Sit with it without shaming yourself, because that moment is the doorway. Walk through it. Be the person who doesn't double down just to save face. Be the person who chooses evolution over being right. Be the person who can say, I'm not proud of that version of me, but I'm committed to becoming better. That is self-respect. That is power. That is enlightenment in real time. And if this message is hitting you not softly but directly, that doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is waking up. Because only someone ready to grow can hear this without shutting down. Only someone with depth can look at themselves without flinching. You are not broken. You are becoming. And becoming requires honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. And this is where I'll pause for now. Not because the work stops here, but because awareness needs space to land. Let this sink in, not as a verdict, but as an invitation. And when you're ready, we'll go deeper. We'll talk about how to take accountability without self-destruction, how to change patterns without losing yourself, how to grow without carrying shame. But for now, just know this. Owning your part doesn't make you small. It makes you free. I'm going to take you further now, because recognizing that you are the problem sometimes is only the doorway. The real work is what you do after the realization wears off, after the initial humility fades, after the clarity passes, after your nervous system wants to go back to what feels familiar. This is where most people stop. They have a moment of insight and mistake it for transformation. They say, I know I need to change, and think that knowing is the same as doing. It's not. Awareness is sharp, but discipline is steady, and growth doesn't respond to intensity. It responds to consistency. So let's talk about the part no one glamorizes. The uncomfortable middle. The phase where you see yourself clearly, but haven't mastered yourself yet. Where you know better, but still feel the pull of old reactions. Where your mouth wants to say one thing and your soul knows another. This is where self-honesty gets tested. Because it's easy to admit fault when you're calm. It's easy to be reflective when no one is challenging you. It's easy to say, I could have handled that better, after the moment has passed. But who are you when you're triggered? Who are you when you feel dismissed? Who are you when you feel disrespected? Who are you when your pride is activated and your ego wants control? That's the version of you that tells the truth. Because character is not revealed in comfort. It's revealed under pressure. And pressure doesn't create who you are. It exposes what's already there. A lot of people confuse emotional reactions with authenticity. They say, that's just how I am. No, that's how you are when you haven't regulated yourself. That's not authenticity. That's conditioning. And conditioning can be unlearned, but only if you stop defending it. Because every time you justify a reaction, you reinforce it. Every time you excuse a behavior, you cement it. Every time you say, they made me act like that, you hand your power away. You are not responsible for what happened to you, but you are responsible for how you respond now, and that responsibility is where your freedom lives. This is where most people get stuck. They confuse accountability with self-attack. They think if they admit fault, they'll spiral into shame, so they avoid looking too closely. They skim the surface. They say, I'm aware, without ever getting specific, but growth lives in the specifics. Not, I have issues, but I interrupt when I feel unheard. Not, I struggle with relationships, but I avoid vulnerability and then resent people for not being close to me. Not, I have trust, but I test people instead of communicating my fears. See the difference? Specificity removes drama. It turns emotional chaos into something workable. And when something is workable, it's no longer overwhelming. You don't change your entire personality. You change moments. You change responses. You change choices one situation at a time. That's how real transformation happens. Quietly, incrementally, without performance. And here's the part that requires real courage. You have to stop centering yourself in every interaction. Not everything is about you. Not every tone is an attack. Not every boundary is rejection. Not every disagreement is disrespect. Sometimes people are tired. Sometimes people are clumsy with words. Sometimes people are dealing with things that have nothing to do with you. And when you make everything personal, you turn neutral moments into conflict. That doesn't make you intuitive. It makes you reactive. Emotional intelligence is knowing the difference. It's knowing when to engage and when to pause, when to speak and when to listen, when to hold your ground and when to soften. That discernment is learned, and it's learned by watching yourself without flinching. A lot of people want to be seen as mature but don't want to practice maturity when it's inconvenient. They want credit for growth without the discomfort that growth demands. But maturity means you don't always get the last word. Maturity means you don't escalate just because you feel triggered. Maturity means you don't punish people with silence. Maturity means you don't say things just to win. Because winning arguments and losing trust is not a victory. And sometimes being the problem wasn't about what you did. It was about what you refused to do. You refused to listen. You refused to compromise. You refused to admit confusion. You refused to ask for help. You refused to take feedback. You refused to slow down long enough to notice the impact you were having. Avoidance can be just as harmful as aggression. Silence can be just as loud as shouting. Withdrawal can wound just as deeply as confrontation. And if you've been honest with yourself, you already know which one you default to. We all have a pattern, one you run to when you feel unsafe. Some people fight, some people flee, some people freeze, some people perform, some people manipulate. None of those patterns mean you're bad. They mean you adapted. But adaptation is not the same as evolution. And what kept you safe once may be costing you now. That's why growth feels threatening. Because you're not just changing behavior. You're letting go of strategies that once protected you. And protection can feel like identity. So when someone challenges that pattern, it feels like an attack on who you are. But it's not. It's an invitation to become more. And here's a truth that requires maturity to hold. You can understand why you behave a certain way and still be responsible for changing it. Your past explains you. It does not excuse you. And using your wounds as a shield will only keep you stuck. Healing is not saying, "This is why I am like this." Healing is saying, "This is why I learned this, and this is why I'm choosing differently now." Choice. That's the word. Everything comes back to. Because the moment you realize you have a choice, you can no longer hide behind helplessness. You can no longer say, "This is just how I am," without knowing you're lying to yourself. And self-betrayal always costs more than accountability. It costs relationships, it costs peace, it costs self-respect. And the longer you avoid that cost, the higher the interest gets. So let's talk about repair, because recognizing you were the problem means nothing if you don't know how to make it right. Repair is not groveling. It's not self-flagellation. It's not begging for forgiveness. Repair is grounded. Repair is clean. Repair is humble without being dramatic. It starts with listening, not listening to respond, listening to understand, letting someone finish without interrupting, letting their experience exist even if it challenges your self-image. Repair means you don't argue with someone's feelings. You don't correct their perception. You don't explain your intentions as a way to erase their pain. You hold space. You say, "I hear you," and you mean it. Repair means you don't rush forgiveness. You understand that trust doesn't reset instantly just because you apologized. You show consistency. You let your actions speak. You respect the time it takes for someone to feel safe again. And sometimes repair doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like release, accepting that not everyone is meant to walk with you into the next version of yourself, accepting that some bridges can't be rebuilt and shouldn't be. Growth doesn't guarantee people will stay. It guarantees you'll become more aligned, and alignment is worth more than approval. Here's another truth people struggle to swallow. You can be the problem and still deserve compassion. Those two things are not opposites. You are allowed to hold yourself accountable without becoming cruel to yourself. Shame does not create change. It creates hiding. It creates defensiveness. It creates self-sabotage. But compassion creates safety. And safety is what allows growth to stick. So when you notice yourself slipping, don't spiral. Notice. Name it. Interrupt it. Try again. That's discipline. That's self-respect. That's how you build trust with yourself. And self-trust is the foundation of every healthy relationship. Because when you trust yourself to regulate, to reflect, to repair, you don't need to control others. You don't need to manipulate outcomes. You don't need to prove your worth. You move differently. You speak differently. You respond instead of react. And people feel that. They feel the difference. Not because you announce it, but because the energy shifts. You're not as volatile, not as guarded, not as defensive. You become safer to be around. And safety is magnetic. Not perfection, not dominance, not intensity, safety. And if that scares you, that's something to look at too. Because some people are addicted to chaos. It feels familiar. It feels alive. Peace feels boring until your nervous system learns it doesn't have to be on high alert. Sometimes being the problem was simply that you didn't know how to be calm without feeling empty. So you stirred things up. You poked. You pushed. You tested. Not because you wanted destruction, but because you wanted reassurance. And reassurance can become manipulation when it's demanded instead of requested. This is where self-regulation matters. Learning how to soothe yourself. Learning how to sit with discomfort without acting it out. Learning how to let feelings pass without turning them into behavior. This is grown work. Unglamorous, uncelebrated, deeply transformative, and it changes everything. Because when you stop being the problem, you don't become passive. You become precise. You choose your words. You choose your battles. You choose your energy. And you stop leaking power through impulsive reactions. You start moving from intention instead of impulse. That's evolution. And if you're listening to this and something in you feels exposed, not attacked, exposed, that's a good sign. Exposure means light. Light means awareness. Awareness means choice. And choice means you're no longer trapped in who you used to be. We're not done. There's more to unpack. Because next we're going to talk about how to hold others accountable without projecting. How to recognize when you're no longer the problem and when it's time to stop over-owning. How to balance responsibility without self-erasure. We're going deeper. But for now, stay here. With the truth. Not to punish yourself, but to free yourself. Because knowing when you are the problem does not mean you become responsible for everything that goes wrong. This is where many people get lost. They swing from denial straight into over-ownership. They go from, it's never me, to, it's always me. Both are distortions. Both are avoidance. Just dressed differently. So let's talk about discernment. Because discernment is the difference between growth and self-erasure. There is a version of accountability that is healthy. And there is a version that is actually self-abandonment wearing the costume of maturity. Healthy accountability says, I own my part. Self-erasure says, I take the blame so you don't leave. Healthy accountability says, I'm willing to change. Self-erasure says, I'll shrink so there's no conflict. Healthy accountability has a spine. Self-erasure folds itself in half to keep the peace. And peace built on self-betrayal is not peace. It's slow suffocation. Some of you learned early that being agreeable was safer than being authentic. That taking responsibility quickly kept tension low. That apologizing even when you weren't wrong kept relationships intact. And it worked. For a while. Until you woke up one day feeling unseen, unmet, resentful, tired, because constantly being the bigger person without being the truer person will hollow you out. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people will weaponize your growth. They will hold you to a higher standard than they hold themselves. They will remind you how self-aware you are every time they want you to fold. They will expect grace without offering accountability. They will benefit from your reflection while avoiding their own. And if you're not careful, you'll mistake that imbalance for humility. It's not. It's emotional labor theft. Growth does not require you to carry the relationship alone. It requires mutual responsibility. Two people willing to look. Two people willing to adjust. Two people willing to repair. If only one person is growing, the relationship becomes lopsided. And lopsided relationships always breed resentment. So how do you know when you are no longer the problem? You know when you've reflected honestly, when you've apologized cleanly, but you are not meant to grow yourself smaller so others can stay comfortable. You are meant to grow clearer, stronger, more aligned. And alignment will cost you people who benefited from your silence. That does not mean you failed. It means you evolved. And here's the part people struggle with. You can set boundaries and still be compassionate. You can say no without being cruel. You can walk away without making someone the villain. You don't need to prove that they're wrong to justify your exit. So stop auditioning for understanding from people committed to misunderstanding you. Your growth does not require consensus. It requires integrity. And integrity means your words and actions match. It means you don't apologize just to smooth things over. It means you don't take responsibility to avoid abandonment. And here's something else you need to understand. When you stop being the problem, in unhealthy dynamics, you may suddenly be labeled as cold, distant, different, difficult. That doesn't mean you regressed. It means the old version of you was easier to control. Growth changes the rules of the relationship, and not everyone wants to play fair. Some people preferred you when you doubted yourself, when you over-explained, when you apologized too much, when you second-guessed your feelings, when you bent. Your clarity feels like rejection to people who relied on your confusion. Let them feel it. You are not responsible for cushioning someone's discomfort with your self-betrayal. This is where discernment sharpens. You stop asking, "How do I keep everyone happy?" and start asking, "How do I stay aligned with who I'm becoming?" And that question will change your life. Because when you are aligned, you don't have to prove your growth. You don't have to announce your boundaries. You don't have to convince anyone that you've changed. The energy speaks, the pattern breaks, the chaos leaves, and peace replaces it. Not the fragile peace that depends on you shrinking, but the grounded peace that comes from self-trust. And self-trust is knowing you will not abandon yourself to be accepted, that you will speak when something is off, that you will leave when something is harmful, that you will own your part without owning someone else's dysfunction. That is real maturity. That is balance. That is power. So if you're listening to this and you feel steadier, not lighter, steadier, that's a good sign. It means you're integrating, not swinging, not overcorrecting, integrating. And integration is the mark of wisdom. We're almost there. There's one more layer we need to talk about. The final shift. The moment where you stop asking, "Am I the problem?" and start asking, "What is being revealed?" Because that's where mastery lives. We'll go there next. This is the last layer, not the loud one, not the dramatic one, the quiet shift that changes everything. This is where you stop living in the question, "Am I the problem?" and you start living in the awareness of what is actually being revealed. Because that question served its purpose. It cracked you open. It humbled you. It taught you responsibility. But if you stay there too long, it turns into self-surveillance. And self-surveillance is not wisdom. It's anxiety disguised as growth. True mastery is when you no longer interrogate yourself endlessly. You observe, you notice, you respond, you move, without panic, without collapse, without overthinking every interaction like it's a trial. This is where self-trust replaces self-doubt. You don't need to ask, "Am I wrong?" every time something feels off. You ask, "What is this showing me?" That question is neutral, grounded, empowering. Because sometimes what's being revealed is that you need to adjust, and sometimes what's being revealed is that you need to walk away, and sometimes what's being revealed is that this dynamic has run its course, not because anyone failed, but because growth changes the landscape. Here's the truth most people never reach. When you've truly done the inner work, you don't spiral after conflict. You reflect and then you settle. You don't obsess over text messages. You don't replay conversations 100 times. You don't need constant reassurance that you're a good person, because you know who you are by how you live, not by how others react. That's peace, not numbness, not avoidance. Peace. You still care, you still feel, but you're not destabilized by every misunderstanding. You don't need to be perfect to feel worthy. You don't need to be liked to feel aligned. You don't need to be chosen to choose yourself. This is where emotional adulthood lives. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-apologizing. You stop over-performing. You let silence exist without rushing to fill it. You let people misunderstand you without chasing clarity at your own expense. You let others have their perspective without needing to correct it. Because clarity inside is louder than validation outside. And this is the moment you stop trying to prove your growth. You don't announce it. You don't defend it. You don't advertise it. You embody it. Your reactions change. Your tolerance changes. Your standards change. Your energy changes. And people feel it before they understand it. Some will rise with you. Some will fall away. Some will test the new version of you just to see if the old one is still accessible. You don't argue. You don't explain. You respond with consistency. That's the boundary. Consistency. Because boundaries spoken without boundaries lived are just words. But boundaries lived don't require speeches. They're felt. They're enforced quietly, naturally, without drama. And here's the final truth I want you to carry. You are not here to be endlessly self-correcting. You are here to be self-directed. There is a difference. Self-correction is reactive. Self-direction is intentional. One is driven by fear of being wrong. The other is guided by clarity of values. When you are self-directed, you don't need constant feedback to know who you are. You don't need conflict to confirm your growth. You don't need approval to validate your direction. You know where you're going because you chose it. And when something doesn't align, you don't internalize it. You assess it. You don't collapse into guilt. You don't harden into blame. You simply decide what stays and what doesn't. That's mastery. And mastery is quiet. It doesn't argue with chaos. It exits it. It doesn't chase closure. It creates peace. It doesn't beg to be understood. It stands rooted. This is where you stop asking, "Am I the problem?" and start saying, "I know who I am. I know my patterns. I know my growth. I know my limits. I know my worth." And from that knowing, you move differently. You speak differently. You love differently. You choose differently. And the world responds differently. Not because you forced it, because you changed the frequency. And as we come to the end of this journey together, I want you to notice something. You're not fired up. You're not frantic. You're not searching. You're grounded, present, clear. That's not by accident. That's integration. That's wisdom settling into the body. That's you no longer needing to become someone else to feel whole. You already did the work. Now you live it. And if this message walked with you instead of talking at you, if it named things you didn't have words for yet, if it helped you stand a little straighter inside yourself, then stay connected. Join the movement. Subscribe to Echoes of Enlightenment Oracle. Not because you need fixing, but because you're evolving. And this path is better walked together.